Small businesses create about half of new jobs and contribute about half of our GDP. So they really are equal players in our economic success with large business, and that has to be front and center when Congress thinks about these kind of things.
The Small Business Rundown is the official podcast of the National Federation of Independent Business, the member-driven voice of small business. NFIB and our members advocate to keep America's small businesses strong and independent in Washington, D.C., all 50 states, and the nation's courts.
Welcome to the Small Business Rundown, a bi-weekly podcast with information on independent businesses' victories and challenges in Washington, D.C. and state capitals. I'm Adam Temple, NFIB Senior Vice President of Advocacy. Today, we're discussing the top federal advocacy issues facing small businesses in 2024. Here to provide an outlook of the year ahead is NFIB President Brad Close and Vice President of Federal Government Relations Jeff Brabant. Brad and Jeff, it's good to have you back.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me here.
We're expecting 2024 to be another busy year for NFIB as numerous pieces of legislation and regulatory concerns are being considered, including the fight to make the 20% small business deduction permanent. Jeff, can you start by giving us an overview on the legislative issues and regulations on the horizon for the next year?
Absolutely. The one interesting thing to consider when you're thinking about 2024 is that it's an election year. Mm-hmm. And when we have an election year, Congress tends to get a little more conservative on what they might want to take up because they know the elections are coming and members of Congress don't always love difficult votes. Now, we also are looking at narrow margins in both chambers of Congress. In fact, come January, there's only a 2-vote majority in the House of Representatives. So these extremely narrow margins make things very difficult to get big things done. What that usually means is that the president, in the past they've said this specifically, is that the pen is mightier than the sword. And the president decides, I'm going to impose a lot of regulations on Congress. And what this means for small business owners is that our legal center will be very busy and our advocacy team will be very busy as well. Because we're going to be looking at issues like overtime, beneficial ownership, and a whole host of other regulations that we're going to be fighting. Now, NFIB's number one priority remains the Main Street Tax Certainty Act and the Small Business Deduction. Because by the end of 2025, over 30 million small business owners will see a tax hike if Congress doesn't act.
Brad, one of the pieces of legislation that Jeff mentioned is the Main Street Tax Certainty Act, our number one priority. It would make the 20% small business deduction permanent. Can you give us a little more on the importance about that bill to the small business community?
Yeah, absolutely. It is very important. It allows independent small business owners to get a 20% deduction on their business income. And really, in a nutshell, it allows them to keep more of their own hard-earned money into their own business. This is not some gift from Congress. This is them being able to keep more of their own money. And they put it to good use. You know, it allows them to increase wages, buy new equipment, create new jobs, and also just to grow and do things in their community. So, you know, when you look at it with a large business, you know, the thousands of dollars that a small business saves and is allowed to keep under this provision may not seem like much, but to a typical small business owner, and there are millions of them, this is really significant and has played a big role in their ability to weather the last tough few years of the economy during COVID.
And the deduction's expiration is looming, essentially imposing a tax hike on small businesses. How do you expect that Congress will approach the legislation next year?
Yeah, well, I think Jeff touched on it. You know, Congress can sometimes take their time. They can wait till the last minute sometimes, and in election years they can be hesitant to do things. But really 2 years is not that much time. Mm-hmm. And if you're a small business owner, you like certainty in the tax code. You like to be able to plan ahead. And they know, looking at this, that in really 2 years' time, they're going to be facing a massive tax increase if Congress doesn't do the right thing here and make this provision permanent.
As Jeff mentioned, there is the hurdle of next year being an election year. What other hurdles do you anticipate as Congress considers the bill?
Well, I think Congress is going to be hearing from large business groups who want different tax breaks that they have extended. And, you know, an important thing to remember here is when Congress passed this law in 2017, they also addressed the corporate rate, and they made that a permanent cut to 21%. So Wall Street, large businesses all got a cut to 21% made permanent. The small business deduction did not. But there are other provisions that large corporations like. So you're going to see some competition from big companies wanting to get more special treatment from Congress. And cutting through all that, we're going to make sure that Congress hears from small business owners to remind them that they need to make this permanent so that small business owners can keep more of their own hard-earned money in the business.
As of today, the bill has 160 co-sponsors in the House, 30 in the Senate. What are the plans to keep this kind of momentum going next year?
So we're going to push really hard. This has to be top of mind on Congress. It's NFIB's number one focus to get this made permanent. And I think it's important when you look at those numbers, especially in the House, that it's a bipartisan support in the House. Because when you look at small businesses, they're all over the country, all different communities, Main Street, states, cities, everywhere. They all are very similar. They want Congress to let them do their jobs, create opportunities in their community, and support their areas. So our job is going to be helping to get those small business owners access to their congressmen, their congresswomen, get their stories told, make sure that Congress understands just how important this is to economic growth.
All right, Brad, before we go, is there anything you or Jeff would like to add?
Well, I think one of the things that gets lost in all this is when you look at the small business economy by itself in America, it is actually the third largest economy in the world behind our overall economy and China. So small businesses create about half of new jobs and contribute about half of our GDP. So they really are equal players in our economic success with large business, and that has to be front and center when Congress thinks about these kind of things.
Just to go over Brad's point again, you need to be active, and members of Congress need to hear from you. So they're going to be hearing from a lot of corporate interests about a lot of corporate tax breaks Brad was discussing. So they need to hear you. You need to reach out to your member of Congress. Go to NFIB.com, fill out the action alert, make sure they know your story and know just how important small business taxation issues are.
All right, Brad and Jeff, thanks for coming back on.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me.
As Brad and Jeff mentioned, the Main Street Tax Certainty Act is a critical piece of legislation, so we'll continue to provide listeners with updates on its journey through Congress. You can find additional information and take action on the small business deduction, as well as other policy issues covered at the start of this episode by checking out our show notes where we've included relevant links. Our next episode premieres on January 25th, and we're diving into state government policy issues and trends our team is seeing across the states. We'll answer questions from listeners regarding these topics, so if there's anything you'd like to hear about, please send us an email at podcast@nfib.org. And now I'd like to thank you, the listeners, for joining us on today's Small Business Rundown. We'll be back every 2 weeks bringing you news and analysis from Washington, D.C. and state capitals so that you, whether you're a business owner or a supporter of one, can continue to blaze a trail.
The Small Business Rundown is brought to you by NFIB, the voice of small business. You can find us at nfib.com and on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn.